Well, Sully's on the couch and he's ready to go. Scout's standing behind the computer on the table. No telling what she's going to do next. I guess you're ready to go. Scout's going to leave. And I suppose I'm ready to go. I'm Ms. Collier, and today we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution in the textile industry. Now, textiles are talking about cloth that you use to make clothing, cloth that you use for upholstery on furniture, any kind of fabric, that's a textile. What you use to make pillows, any of that stuff, that's a textile. And let me share my screen here with my mad skills. And we'll start talking about how the Industrial Revolution changed all of that. Yeah, I should have done that first, but I didn't. There we go. Okay, so originally, making clothing, making cloth, people couldn't just go down to the store and buy garments that were already made. Like you can go to any store that sells clothing and buy a pair of blue jeans. You can buy t-shirts. You can buy any of the stuff, socks, underwear, any of the stuff that you need. You can go and buy. It's already made. It's there. It's in a package. It's got a size written on it. You look at it. You can try it on a lot of the time and see if it's going to fit you, whatever. None of that was available originally. People had to make their own clothes or pay someone to make them for them. They had to be measured so that, the clothing fit you. It was just, a labor intensive. And before that even, they had to make the cloth because the cloth didn't exist. Cloth comes from some type of fiber that is then manipulated and put together to make fabric, to make material. Generally, the fibers come from either animals or plants. Animals, you're talking usually sheep, some types of goats. I've heard of people who can make stuff. I've heard of people who will comb their dogs and cats and spin that into yarn. I think that's just weird, and I think that's just not a widespread practice. I don't see that happening very much. Mostly, it was sheep and goats that they would shear because you take the hair from the animal. It doesn't kill the animal, doesn't hurt the animal survives another year. Next year you get another big batch of wool from your sheep. They would wash this. This is the animal and the sheep being sheared in this first picture here. The second picture is what they call wool cards, C-A-R-D-S. And they would comb the wool out so that it got all straight and pulled out because it's kind of curly. First they had to wash it at some point in there, and I'm not sure, it depends on who you read. They would dye the wool, they would color it a different color. At this point, all of the dyes were made from plants. I know that they could grind up the shells of like walnuts and make a dark brown color. There were some plants that they could use to make blue, some plants they could use to make red. Very few of their clothing was bright colored at this point because it was just easier to get the stuff that made the darker colored dyes. In fact, there was thank you, Scout. There was a particular dye that was a purple dye that came from a place in the Middle East. It was a town called Lydia, and it was a very famous purple dye. It was extremely expensive. It was so expensive that it was a color that was used. Only kings and queens could wear purple because they were basically the only ones who could afford it. The prettier the color, the more it cost, basically. So that's why when you see pictures of like pilgrims and Puritans and old time people who were not the very, very wealthy people, they were usually dressed in dark colors, plain colors, because they had to make it themselves and they had to get what they could afford to get. Then you see this lady here sitting, and this is a spinning wheel. and she takes the fibers of the wool or cotton is, I didn't talk about plants, did I? Plants that they can use to make fabric, anything that has a fiber, cotton. Although cotton was very difficult because it has these little tiny seeds inside each of the little balls of cotton, and you have to comb those out, and it takes 5 ever apparently to do that. I've never done it, but I've seen pieces of cotton with the little seeds in them, and I can imagine that if that's going to be, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that with my life. I don't want to do that. Linen is a plant that has fibers that come from it that they use. Flax is another. Sometimes they would use hemp to make fibers and to make into fibers and to make into clothing. Anything that they could make fibers out of, they could use. But cotton was the big one, but it was expensive because it was very labor intensive because of all the little seeds in it. So anyway, this lady is spinning and taking the fibers and twisting them together over this wheel that you can see here and spinning them into a thread. And depending on what she's making, it depends on how thin the thread is. A lot of times it would be thicker like yarn, but you know, if you've looked at yarn, there's lots of different thicknesses of yarn. It goes all the way from little skinny yarn that they use to make socks up to that great big bulky yarn that they use to make, I don't know what, afghans, and they make a lot of hats and scarves out of that huge thick yarn. But depending on what she is wanting to make is how thick she will make the yarn or the thread. And then finally, the last part of the process of making just the cloth is that it would have to be woven together. They would string all of these strings through this loom, and this right here is called a shuttle, and they've got a lot more yarn wrapped on it. And you would, this is called the beater bar right here, and you would pull that towards you, and it would squish all of these fibers down together. Then you would lift up or lift down the heddle and the beater bar, whichever you had just done, you would do the opposite. So if it was set on a down, you would lift it up, and that would change the threads so that the bottom threads would come up to the top, and you would run that shuttle back through there, pull the beater bar towards you again, lower the heddle, and then run the shuttle back through the other way, and that would encase, it would alternate so that the thread on the shuttle is surrounded by the other threads and kind of locked in place. And that's what would make the cloth. It was an extremely time-consuming process. Making cloth and gathering and trying to preserve food so that you would have food in the winter pretty much took up everybody's time. That's basically what people who were not extremely wealthy and had servants to do all of this mess for them did with their lives. All right. So in 1712, a man named Thomas Newcomen in Great Britain or in England invented the first steam engine. And it was powered by burning something to heat water, and then the water produced the steam, which caused this hammer-looking thing to move, and that's how that worked. Steam would become the power source that fueled the Industrial Revolution. This is where all of it starts. It takes a while to get there, but this is where it starts. Someone has caught a spider over there. I'm just going to leave it for now. 1733, John Kay invented this. Now you saw this on that picture of the loom that I showed you. I could not find a picture of the shuttle that was used before this one. This is the flying shuttle. You can see it's pointy, kind of tapered on both ends, and it allows the weaver to kind of throw the shuttle through, and it would go through fast, and that somehow allowed them to make wider bolts of cloth. And you can see why this would be advantageous, because if you can only make a cloth this wide, you got to make lots of it to be able to make like a shirt. But if you can make it a lot wider, now you don't have to make as much at one time. You can get a lot more done in one time, and you don't have to sew as much of it back together. You can cut it out, like the whole front of a shirt, the whole back of a shirt. You don't have to sew those pieces all together to kind of make into a shirt. You still have to attach the sleeves and whatnot, but it's not as much stuff. He claimed that this would allow one weaver to make more fabric by themselves than two weavers working and using a traditional shuttle. I don't know if that's true or not, or if that's just advertising. In 1724, the first cotton mill, the Thorpe Mill, opened in Lancashire, England. It used water power, and what this mill was doing was using steam to begin to spin cloth using when it came, and then the spinning jenny came along and really sent that going faster. James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny in Great Britain, and it allowed one worker to make multiple spools of thread at one time. You see each one of these little pointy dudes right down here, each one of those is a spindle, and each one of those is a different spool of thread. So this one woman's making like about, I don't know, 20 spools of thread right here at this one time. And all she's kind of doing is monitoring that while the thing is spinning, that it's doing the right thing and making sure that there's not any problems. She's not individually spinning each one of these. So it was much, much faster. In 1764, Richard Arkwright invented the water frame. This was even more mechanized, spinning cotton into thread. It was much faster and required very little human labor. So it was an improvement even on the spinning jenny. That's what happens. Somebody sees somebody else's invention and thinks, you know what, I can make that better. And so they come along and come up with something that's even better usually. In 1779, you have the spinning mule. Samuel Compton invented this in Great Britain, and it allowed one worker to use multiple spindles to weave several bolts of cloth at the same time. See, each of these pieces right here, each of these is a bolt, would be a bolt of cloth. And this could be used for wool or cotton or any other fiber that they could use to make into fabric. In 1781, James Watt patented the improved steam engine, which was adaptable to use in factories or in transportation. So this is where the real takeoff begins, because now you have a much more reliable, much easier to use steam engine that you can use in many different ways. So 1785, Edmund Cartwright invented the power loom. This was mechanized and sped up the process of weaving fabric. So instead of that one person sitting and lifting that thing up and throwing that shuttle through and beating it with that beater bar and then lowering it and throwing the shuttle through the other way and then beating it with that beater bar, in each of those separate movements, it takes 3 of those separate movements to make one row in the cloth. This thing did it mechanized. It was driven by steam, so it was running on its own. 1787, cotton goods production increased 10 times, tenfold since 1770. So in less than 20 years, cotton has increased by 10 times. It was still very expensive to produce because of all those little seeds in it. But this starts to lead more to the, hey, we can make lots of money raising cotton. Let's get lots of land, scout. Let's get lots of land, and we got to have people to run it. So this starts the big increase of the plantation economy and the rise of, there'd already always been slavery, or since very early on been slavery in the Americas, but this starts the increase because now we need lots and lots of people to pick all that cotton, to pick all those seeds out of it so that we can sell the cotton and make lots of money. In 1793, Samuel Slater opened the first textile mill in Rhode Island. So this is when the Industrial Revolution actually comes to the United States. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in the US, which speeded up the process of separating the cotton fibers from the cotton seeds. You can't see it really well, but this machine here has combs in it that you put the cotton in and turn this wheel with these combs, and it combs the fibers out and lets the seeds fall out and keeps the fibers separate. And then you can take the seeds and sell that so that somebody can plant new cotton for next year, and you have the fibers to sell on as bolts or bowls of cotton to be woven into fabric. It was said that one cotton gin could produce 50 pounds of fibers in one day. And that doesn't sound like a lot to us, but that was more than 50 men could produce in the same amount of time working by hand. So when you look at it that way, this is a huge improvement. And this is not a mechanized, it's technically a machine, but it's still driven, somebody has to stand there and crank it. It's not driven by steam or any other type of power. It's still human powered. But this is a huge, huge improvement on how the cotton was prepared. In 1804, a man named Joseph Marie Jacquard invented the Jacquard loom. It used punch cards to weave complex designs, and it could follow a set pattern that was coded into these cards. I don't know if you can see it really well, but you see there's holes punched in these cards. Now, you kids don't remember this. Maybe some of your teachers might. They're as old as me, they will. When I first started learning about computers, we didn't have computers that sat on our desks. We didn't have computers at home. Only schools and big offices had computers because they were huge. They had come down in size from when, they took up the size of the entire gym. They were kind of in the middle size there, but they ran on these punch cards, and you would have to code these cards, and you had to learn this special language to talk to computers, and there were several different ones of them that you had to learn. But you would have to code in on the card, and the ones that we had, they weren't punch cards. They were coded with a pencil, like when you do your Scantrons, or when you take the STAR test and you have to bubble in your answer sheet. It was that kind of a thing, and you had to bubble it in just right. And each card had one command on it. So, a really long process was going to be a stack of cards like this. And if you messed up on any one card, it wouldn't run. So this is where that started, with these punch cards. And this is a fairly simple design, but we still have Jacquard fabric now. And it's a design that's woven into the cloth. So you can see that's pretty cool too, because before mostly they could only do stripes without, working really hard at it. This, it does it by itself. And we still have Jacquard cloth today that's pretty cool. In 1846, Elias Howe invented the sewing machine. Now, this doesn't look anything like the sewing machines that we're used to seeing. This was the very first sewing machine. You see, this is where the needle is, and you would run your fabric through there and with one hand and turn this crank with the other hand, and the crank made the needle go up and down, and that's how it sewed. He claimed that the sewing machine sewed 10 times faster than a human. And we do know for sure that the machine was able to outsew 5 people at one time in one demonstration. So he may have been exaggerating a little bit, but it was a lot faster. This is the very first sewing machine as we know, now you can go to Walmart and buy a sewing machine for not a hideous amount of money. And a lot of them are computerized and they do all kinds of cool stuff. Synthetic dye. Remember I told you how the original way that they would make fabric colored was through naturally occurring dyes that they could get from nature and things around them, like plants or shells from walnuts or whatever. William Perkin, who was 18 years old and was trying to design or to manufacture a chemical called quinine, or quinine if you're British, that would fight malaria, which is a very devastating disease, messed up. He was 18 and he accidentally invented a synthetic dye. Now this dye was this purple here and he called it mauverine, which is a terrible name, but he called it that. And this was the first dye that was produced using chemicals. And so he could reproduce it over and over and over again once once you know the chemical compounds and what you have to do to combine it, you can reproduce the same color over and over and over again. Instead of, wow, I did this, I ground up this many walnuts and it came out this color. I ground up the same number of walnuts and it came out this color, kind of a deal. It made it much less expensive to have bright colors because now it was done by chemicals instead of finding these very rarely occurring plants that made it more expensive. In 1816, factories were becoming widespread in America. They were installing large numbers of the power looms, the ones that would weave the cloth, and the production of textiles was becoming automated. So and mostly in America, this was in the northern part of the country. The southern part of the country was still working on just doing agriculture and growing the cotton. Then it was being sent to the north and turned into fabric, or it was being sold to England and turned into fabric there. And there were not any factories that did the actual textile weaving or whatnot in the South. In 1861, the Civil War began. The Union soldiers, these blue uniforms here, wore uniforms that were made by machines in factories. The Confederate soldiers wore uniforms that were made from hand-spun and hand-woven fabrics. Because remember, like I said, they did not have any factories in the South. So, and the people in the North weren't going to make their uniforms for them and then sell them to them. So they had to make their own out of homespun stuff. In 1884, Hilary Chardonnay, which doesn't sound like anything, I think he was in France somewhere, developed the first synthetic fiber. A synthetic fiber is made from something that is not naturally occurring. It's a man-made fiber. This one was made by mashing plants into pulp and adding really toxic chemicals. In 1910, so it took a while, his synthetic fiber, Chardonnay's synthetic fiber, was produced in the United States. It was originally known as artificial silk, but now we call it rayon. Not sure why. In 1935, nylon was invented by a man named Wallace Carruthers, and it was developed using products from petroleum and carbon products that were used to make fossil fuels. They were byproducts of fossil fuels that were left over, and he used them to make nylon. And we still have lots of nylon today. I'm not sure rayon is used as much, but nylon is still used a lot. You can see nylon string. They use nylon in things like windbreakers, jackets, and that kind of thing. And of course, nylon is used to make pantyhose that some women still wear. Some of us have quit wearing them, and that's okay. In 1970, in the US, computerized knitting machines were introduced into factories. These produced very complex patterns in fabrics very quickly. And this is one that you can see here, and it would have been knitted by a machine like this. You can see all of the different colors up there, and it runs on a computer program, not those punch cards. Well, in 1970, it may still have run by the punch cards. It probably did. They still use these types of things today, but now they'll be run by a computer with a keyboard like what we're more used to seeing. In 1980, they introduced robots into textile factories. This reduced the amount of human labor that was needed because it was, repetitive motions and that sort of thing that were computerized. And these weren't the robots like we think of that, look like people. These were more like the robots. If you've ever seen the movie Iron Man, the first one, and when Tony Stark is trying to build his suit after he is brought back home, he has these two robots that stand around, and he tells them to put him out if he catches on fire, and they don't seem to be real bright. That's this kind of robot. That's what these look like. So that's all of that. I'm sure there have been more developments, but these were the ones that I thought were the most interesting to see in the textile industry. Some of us still crochet or knit or make fabrics by hand from weaving. I have an aunt who used to keep her own sheep and shear them every year and then dye the fabric. She told me she used Kool-Aid to dye the fabric because it had such bright colors that she liked, and it wasn't very expensive to buy because, Kool-Aid, you just didn't add the sugar to it. You just used the powder. And then she had a huge loom that took up like most of her living room, and you sat at it and you would weave huge bolts of cloth, and then she would sell the cloth to people who made their own clothes from it. She doesn't do it any longer, but it was very interesting. It was cool to watch. I was always wanting to learn how to do it. But there we are. Maybe I'll learn now that I'm retired. I suppose that's all I have for you today. Thank you for joining me. I think I'll have to go check and see what happened with that spider over there. If you have any comments, please make them in the comment section. Let me know what you thought. And I suppose I'll see you next time. All right, Sully, I think we're done.